Good luck.
Platformers have consistently been my favorite genre of game for as far back as I can remember. The allure and appeal of short-term, reactive, action-based experiences have been a core influence in how I choose to engage with nearly all other video games. Most of these works, despite their lengths, establish a strong foundation for what makes a game enjoyable, particularly through their use of unique, satisfying systems that invite connectivity with the player. Looking back, they collectively point toward a broader understanding of enjoyment in games, raising the question of whether a game's length is inherently tied to the depth and substance it offers. That idea feels increasingly distant when looking at the broader standard of the industry today, where length is often coupled and equated with value, with scope being a substitute for substance. Historically, games were short out of necessity, limited by memory and hardware constraints, but those limitations demanded a kind of design clarity that prioritized player engagement over all else. Preference is, of course, a factor in how a designated genre is conceived, interpreted, and received, but the underlying structure of these shorter experiences often reveals a more consistent understanding of what makes a game engaging in the first place. Without the ability to rely on scale or excess, these games are forced to refine their core systems, placing emphasis on immediacy, responsiveness, and player-driven improvement. This is not to say that all short games, nor all older games, are inherently good or bad. Whether an experience is successful falls on a multitude of factors, but there is typically a clear, shared understanding of what constitutes quality and what does not. The simplicity found in many of these games is not a limitation, but a core part of their design philosophy, encouraging player improvement within the brief time the game demands. I would argue that there is meant to be an implied substance in many shorter-term experiences, one that isn't immediately given to the player, but instead revealed through repetition and refinement. While there is a subjective, relative, and interpretive notion of what qualifies as a short game, in this instance, I'm speaking to the experiences that actively incentivize brevity in regards to completion, rather than simply measuring how many hours it takes to reach the end. These games are designed around efficiency, where time itself becomes a metric of performance rather than just progression, and where the player is encouraged to engage with the system beyond a single playthrough. This is especially evident in games that include active tracking systems, presenting and rewarding the player for completing them in as little time as possible. Ranking systems further reinforce this idea, pushing the player to perform to the best of their ability, often in cases where reaction-based play is prioritized above all else. Going in tandem with the concept of completing a stage as quickly as possible, these systems also reward skill-based decision-making, encouraging the player to think on their toes and fully engage with what the game prescribes. The mastery isn't an optional aspect of the experience, rather embedded into the structure itself. Devil May Cry 3 serves as a clear example of this specific design philosophy. As an action-adventure hack-and-slash, it can last the better part of 4 hours on a first playthrough with relatively inexperienced play. However, the true allure lies in maintaining a sense of flow throughout that experience, consistently mastering the movement and combat systems the game provides. Through weapon swapping, style switching, and maneuvering in response to enemies and the surrounding environment, the player is constantly refining their approach, turning what could be a brief experience into something far more substantial through repeated engagement, creating a satisfying and rewarding loop of moving Dante through puzzles and slaughtering hordes of enemies with both style and grace. Using DMC as a basis for a concept applicable to almost any game, there should always be a baseline level of involvement throughout gameplay, attained through a certain degree of complexity within its structure. The draw should be based on the proper exploitation of the tools given to the player, allowing them to consistently perform in any given scenario without prolonged downtime or inactivity. Each player will have their own level of indulgence for what is expected of them, rather than adhering to a rigid, linearly defined set of markers. This flexibility allows the experience to scale with the player's ability, encouraging both immediate engagement and long-term mastery. Devil May Cry operates with a relatively high skill floor as an action game, especially in comparison to a lower skill floor platformer like Mario, or a more moderate, controlled skill floor found in on-rails shooters like Star Fox. Rather than functioning as a simple slider, this relationship acts as more of a spectrum, where both the skill floor and ceiling shift depending on the genre and the demands placed on the player. However, it is the height of the skill ceiling in relation to the placement of the floor that truly defines where a player will typically fall in terms of participation. In theory, a game's difficulty should rise in tandem with the player's knowledge and experience, using the skill floor as an entry point and allowing enough space within the ceiling to accommodate continued growth. This creates a system where improvement feels both natural and rewarding, rather than forced or stagnant. Without that upward range, player engagement plateaus quickly, as there is little incentive to refine or expand beyond the most basic level of interaction. Finding brevity in short games is intrinsic to their core appeal, and, in my eyes, what ultimately makes them so enticing. As someone who enjoys and at times prefers longer-term experiences, it is this sense of concentrated engagement that continues to stand out. These games do not rely on extended playtime to justify their value, but instead demand a level of interaction that feels immediate, consistent, and rewarding throughout. In that sense, their appeal lies not in how long they last, but in how effectively they use the time they ask of the player. When viewed under this particular lens, shorter games begin to reveal their length as a point of strength rather than limitation in achieving their overall objective. The brevity becomes a dev tool rather than a constraint, incentivizing and deriving a certain degree of satisfaction from what a game will present. Though on the surface, unless faced with a genre of game that would be otherwise ever-changing like a roguelike, they may seem like linear experiences. This would simply be untrue. There is always a level of change within each playthrough that alters a game in a manner that isn't tied to additional in-game experiences, like additional levels, alternate paths, or side characters. Instead, the core revolves around how you change, how you interpret and see what's given differently than how you did before. It's tied to a level of personal progression that is engaging on a deeper level, where the systems remain constant but your understanding of them evolves. Not every game will have what a Devil May Cry, a Metroid, or a Resident Evil may have in terms of layered systems, structural depth, or mechanical expression. However, there should exist a middle ground between making something so easy or basic that it actively undermines the core experience. Perhaps a moment of reflection onto what truly makes a game enjoyable would benefit the wider industry. A focus on the parts that actively reach out to the player and encourage them to pick up the controller and try again. These are the design elements that foster curiosity, persistence, and eventual mastery, even in the absence of supplemental aspects. When a game successfully creates that internal pull, a drive to return, the repetition itself becomes meaningful rather than repetitive. In that sense, the value lies not just in what is added to the experience, but in how the experience continues to reshape the player time and time again.